Welcome, everybody. I'm Ian Rasmussen, your chair for this debate, a debate that concerns perhaps the most momentous political decision of our age. And on behalf of my collaborators, His Honour Dr Derek Halbert and the Law Department, Dr Eddie Tembo of Politics and Jonathan Harper of CSU, I thank you all hugely for demonstrating your support by being here. Our motion today is: this House considers that the UK should remain as a member of the EU. And to propose it, we have on my right, and no political inference intended, Lord Daffyd Wigley. He served as Plaid Cymru Member of Parliament for Carnarvon from 1974 to 2001, and as an Assembly Member for Carnarvon from 1999 until 2003. He was leader of Plaid Cymru from 1991 to 2000, and he took his seat in the House of Lords as Baron Wigley of Carnarvon in 2011. His seconder is Michael Mitchell, who's a first-year politics student. To my left, we have Dr Ruth Lea, CBE, a distinguished economist and writer who has had careers in civil service, the media and banking, spanning nearly 50 years. Among her many honours, Ruth is a Freeman of the City of London, was awarded a CBE last year and holds an honorary doctorate from this university. Her seconder is Lewis Charlton, who is a second-year law student. I would like you to thank them for attending here today. Now, the principal speakers will be invited to speak in turn for about 15 minutes. They will then be followed by their seconders, who will each speak for about 5 minutes, and I will then take questions from the floor, and we will end no later than 3:45 after a vote. I'd like to invite Lord Wigley to take the stand.
Well, Chair, distinguished and aspiring academics, good afternoon, and thank you so much for allowing me over Offarsdyke and into the noble city of Chester. Something that couldn't be taken for granted in bygone ages when we didn't exactly enjoy a free movement of people, goods and money over our borders, and when we Welsh might have been lynched if we were found within the city walls. Even more so, thank you for the invitation to present briefly some of the arguments why I feel that the United Kingdom should vote on the 23rd of June to remain in the European Union and to work from within with our 27 partners to build a union that not only serves our own best interests, but equally serves the common interests which we, as citizens of the European Union, all share. A union that plays a full role in a wider world. I shall put my case under 6 headings, and the first is security. Now, my parents lived through 2 world wars which tore our continent apart. The First World War left some 16 million dead, with war memorials in every town and village in these islands. We shall remember the slaughter on the Somme this July. And I'm old enough to remember the aftermath of the Second World War, when city centres in Liverpool, in Swansea, in Coventry and London were little more than bombed out hulks. People came together after the end of the World War II, determined that never again should such a fate strike our continent. The vision of a united Europe grew out of that suffering. The coal and steel industries were pooled between France, Germany, Italy, Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg in 1951, specifically in order to make it physically impossible for those countries to go to war against each other. And since then, we've lived through the longest period of peace between the nations within the EU, the longest such period in 4 centuries. That hasn't been true for all the world. Since 1945, there have been over 100 wars fought around the globe, and some still claiming lives every single day. It isn't even true for the whole of Europe. There's been bloodshed in Bosnia and Croatia, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Poland, all when they were outside the European Union. We mustn't for one moment take for granted that we have some God-sent right to live in peace with our European neighbours. It's something for which we have to work constantly and consistently to ensure that your generation doesn't suffer what my parents' contemporaries across Europe had to endure. We forget at our peril a vision of a continent at peace with itself, which drove the early advocates of European unity, including Winston Churchill himself. Some will argue that it's NATO and not the European Union that has helped keep the peace by finely tuned balancing act of assured mutual nuclear destruction, were we to go to war. That may be fine while it lasts, but our role in NATO isn't at stake in this referendum. But surely it's infinitely better, isn't it, that we defuse situations that lead to war by engaging in a partnership, as provided by the European Union, in which we live in harmony and resolve our differences by discussion, rather than depending on military balancing acts, which, if they go wrong, could lead to Armageddon. And remember also that it was Europe which provided a framework for reconciliation for Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal, and to move from dictatorship to democracy. Our contemporary security includes engaging with our European partners in coping with the surge of refugees from Africa, Asia and the Middle East. I can't for the life of me see how less cooperation across Europe somehow helps to resolve that problem. And then there's the question of the future of the UK itself. If there's an overall vote to leave, with Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales voting to stay in the EU, we face a constitutional crisis. The SNP government in Edinburgh, which looks likely to be re-elected in a landslide in May, they've made it clear that this scenario is one which would almost certainly reopen calls for a second independence referendum, which in these new circumstances could well lead to a vote to leave the UK in order to remain part of the EU. That would mean customs posts on Hadrian's Wall, a development I certainly don't want to see between Wales and England. I'd much rather see a confederal or quasi-federal relationship of the nations of the UK within a united Europe. Brexit, of course, would make that impossible. But if there are problems arising from Scotland, just think of the ones in Northern Ireland, where Brexit could lead to the establishment of a land border between the UK and the EU, requiring people and goods travelling between the north and south of Ireland to clear customs and passport control. And remember, between 1922 and 1972, Irish citizens had free movement into the UK and could enjoy joint citizenship. There's a real danger that Brexit turns the clock back and could reopen the Irish troubles, which the EU did so much, indeed, to resolve. In 1975, Northern Ireland was the only part of the UK to vote against EU membership. By now, they are, quite understandably, the area with the strongest polling for remaining in the EU. So I appeal to you, the young generation, to put these security considerations high on your agenda, not to the exclusion of all else, the economic, social, regional, environmental, agricultural, educational and cultural considerations, but a very powerful dimension which needs some overwhelming counter-argument to push to the margins. Now let me address these issues. My opponent today has a distinguished career as an academic economist. My career before entering Westminster was in manufacturing industry, initially with the Ford Motor Company, then Mars Limited, and then financial controller with Hoover Washing Machines in Wales. All these were American companies. I later chaired a small company which we set up to make medical equipment, which we sold around the globe. So I'm not one of those politicians who's never done a proper job. We have in Wales over 200 American companies and 50 Japanese companies who came to Wales to manufacture for European markets. One of them, Toyota, is nearby in Flintshire. We offer the best of both worlds, a country which speaks English and a country in a home market of 500 million people. We also have within a stone's throw of here the Airbus factory at Broughton, which recently wrote to their 15,000 employees warning them of the dangers of leaving the EU. 45% of Britain's exports are sold to the European Union. If we leave the EU, we shall have to negotiate a trade agreement, as did Canada, and it took them 7 years to do so. We're told that we should aim at having a similar relationship as has Norway, who, to secure their trade agreement, have to accept EU regulations with no direct voice in their formulation. And to enjoy a free movement of goods, they have to accept a free movement of people, as the former Prime Minister of Sweden recently reminded the UK. From all my experience, I haven't the slightest doubt that it's preferable for the UK manufacturing sector to be in a home market of more than 500 million people, not sitting on an offshore island that has detached itself from its main customers. I found it to be totally incredible that Nigel Lawson said on Sunday that the EU single market, and I quote, is not important. We live in a largely free trade world. As Brexit are increasingly losing the argument on questions of access to the EU market, they now seem to be playing down its significance. Membership of the EU has been of benefit to working people and not just to corporate bosses. It's the EU which championed social provisions, my third heading. Those include health, hygiene and safety at work, statutory parental leave, the Working Hours Directive, and safeguarding employees' rights when company ownership is transferred. There needs to be a consistency of employee safeguards across a trading area by way of regulations in these social matters to ensure that unscrupulous employers don't seek a competitive advantage by exploiting their workforce. Incidentally, in the context of disability provisions, it was the EU initiatives which led to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2007, a subject very close to my heart. Can I say a word about the so-called regulatory burden? The overwhelming majority of our rules and regulations come from within the UK itself, rubber-stamped by Parliament, though not well scrutinised or debated. And let's remember that of those regulations that emanate from Brussels, the UK has had a voice in their formulation, and UK civil servants play a leading role in that work. In fact, the rules drawn up in Brussels are democratically subject to a double lock, that of both the European Parliament and the UK Parliament. The last UK government instituted an inquiry into the balance of competences between Westminster and Brussels, studying over 30 subject areas. It failed to identify any single regulatory competence which they felt it was necessary to repatriate to the UK. Certainly business will balk at restrictive regulation, whether they come from Brussels, Westminster or indeed Cardiff Bay. But they exist for a purpose, to safeguard employees and customers alike. And if we are to sell goods within the EU market, we have to accept this as a fact of life. Say Brexit, if they just decided at Westminster that would enable us to refuse them. Yes, indeed, it would. And in so doing, it would block our ability to export to the EU market. You can't have it both ways, cherry-picking the bits of the EU which we like, but refusing to play by the rules which ensure that everyone has fair play within that market. And of course, there are many aspects of the EU which cause frustration. I believe that at times there has been over-regulation, a frustration which is shared by many parts of the EU. And I put it to you that it's Britain's job to be out there, at the centre, arguing the case for reform, not sitting on the fringes, moaning about the rules, but having abandoned our right to negotiate sensible outcomes for the benefit of everyone in Europe. David Cameron is absolutely right to be pressing the subsidiarity principle, whereby decisions should be taken as close as possible to those it affects. If a decision can be taken in London that doesn't undermine the single market, then that decision should be taken in London, not in Brussels. And if it can be taken in Cardiff, or indeed in Liverpool or Manchester, it shouldn't be taken in London. Subsidiarity was a fundamental principle of the EU, and we need to ensure that it works. But there are some decisions that have to be taken on a EU level. One thinks of environmental considerations, my fourth heading, where it isn't within the power of any one single country to control atmospheric or maritime pollution. The EU played a central role in securing the Paris Agreement on climate change last December. I realise that some Brexiteers don't accept the dangers of global warming and therefore want to avoid regulations on climate change. My opponent will tell you, no doubt, where she stands on these issues. But there is a need for a consistency in the rules that affect the market if we are within one trading bloc, whether or not we're within the EU. Fifthly, the EU regional economic policies, and particularly the structural funds, from which many parts of the UK have benefited. Yes, Wales, but also Merseyside, South Yorkshire, Cornwall and Northern Ireland, old industrial areas that needed a help to get the economy moving again. In Wales, we've been receiving structural funds for the past 15 years, and we shall benefit by over £2 billion between now and 2020. Overall in Wales, we get some £40 per person more from the EU than we pay in. Claimed Brexit, if we leave the EU, that money would be funded directly from Westminster and Whitehall. Really? That wasn't our experience before 2000. when Wales wasn't getting major European structural funds, what we got from the Treasury was nothing like the scale of funding which we now get from the EU. When we did eventually get EU Objective 1 funding in Wales in 2000, what did the Treasury do? They said thank you very much to Brussels and pocketed the money without passing a brass farthing over to Wales on the basis that Westminster already provided a quite adequate regional policy. We had to take our case to Brussels and argue it with Regional Commissioner Michel Barnier, and only after he intervened did Gordon Brown climb down and pass the money to which we were entitled to the National Assembly. So please don't give me all that gratuitous nonsense about Nanny in Whitehall being a better guardian of our interests. Incidentally, there's one thing I just don't understand. That English-speaking people regard Brussels as somewhere alien, a foreign land where they don't want to engage. When I first went out to Brussels in the late 60s and 1970s, yes, English was on the margins. The lingua franca of bureaucrats was overwhelmingly French. But this has changed, and it's now largely English. Britain has won the battle to get English as the common ground of dialogue for 28 nations, and we're possibly about to turn our backs on it and walk away. What a way to grab defeat from the jaws of victory. In agricultural terms, farming in Wales would be devastated if we left the EU. 97% of our sheep meat exports go to the EU, and so does 92% of our beef exports. If we were outside the EU, we would have to negotiate tariff arrangements and face anything between 14% and 70% tariffs on our agricultural products, which would totally undermine their competitiveness out in the European market. Both the NFU and the Farmers Union of Wales are strongly of the view that our best interests are indeed to stay in the EU. Then there's the question of our right to unrestricted travel within the EU, something that has grown enormously since I was a student in Manchester University. In those days, travelling was a nightmare. At one time, you could only take £50 out of the country with you. Friends of mine who toured Europe with their jazz group had to get clearance papers in advance for every instrument at every border they crossed. Do we really want to go back to that sort of a situation? We now have arrangements for students to benefit from exchange programmes facilitated by the EU, as you well know. And it was in fact a Brit, a Welshman to boot, Howell Carey-Jones, who, as an official in Brussels, established the Erasmus programme, which has been of so great benefit to academic institutions and benefited some 5 million students, for whom having Erasmus on their CV opens doors around the world. And the new Erasmus Plus programme will be particularly helpful for non-academic vocational training, particularly for apprenticeships. Can I finally open the argument to something broader than how many economic fairies can dance on the pinhead of a Brussels regulation? The basic question we have here is whether we want to see Britain retracting itself from engagement with the European continent and looking in on itself in a narrow, blinkered, myopic manner. Is that the sort of country we want to pass over to our children and grandchildren? In Wales, we have deep European roots in language and culture, in folklore, in music, in law, in our religious beliefs and their associated values. Our world is deeply rooted to our common European heritage. The values of ancient Greece and Rome are fundamental to our civilization, as they are in a slightly different mix for our neighbours in Scotland and in England. Please, oh please, let's not cut ourselves off from this essential dimension of our identity. And to you, the younger generation, please face the challenge, get engaged in the debates, and on the 23rd of June, use your vote, earlier if you've got a postal vote, to be part of this momentous decision. Your future is at stake. It's the world in which we live that is being determined. Young people in Scotland, however they voted in 2014, took that responsibility. Please do likewise, to build the world you want, which I hope means voting for an outward-looking, internationally minded future for these islands. This is our continent. Let's stop sulking on the fringes. Let's get stuck in, helping to strengthen it where it's weak, and helping to mould it to a form that will be acceptable to all the diverse people with whom we share it. Let's reclaim the continent, which is ours in its values and its visions, so that it can also be that of our children for centuries to come. Diolch yn fawr.
Well done, old chap. Hello, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here in my home county of Cheshire. And I must say, last year when I was awarded the doctorate from this university, I felt very, very honoured indeed. And I thought the ceremony in Chester Cathedral was absolutely terrific. It was one of the brightest days of my life. Well, in my time, of course, I shall oppose the motion that this House considers the UK should remain as a member of the European Union. I shall be making the case for voting leave on the 23rd of June. And my motivation for really wanting to leave the European Union is that I want to live in a self-governing democracy, like the vast majorities of countries on this planet. At the last count, as I understand it, there are 193 countries in the United Nations as members of the United Nations. 28 of them were in the European Union. And you don't have to be a whiz-kid mathematician to realise the vast majority of nations on this planet actually do not live in the European Union, and a lot of them thrive and survive very nicely, thank you. Whether it's Australia or New Zealand or Canada or Australia or India or United States of America, you name it, Norway or Switzerland. These countries do very nicely, thank you, without being a member of the EU. And so it's certainly not a necessity. Actually, I really wish to live in a country that governs itself and is in happy cooperation with countries across the globe, not just in Europe. And I suppose I'm partly influenced by this because as part of my career, I worked for the Japanese and I worked for the Americans. And it wasn't that I felt European, I suppose I felt British first, but I just felt that I was part of a global community. And when I went to Tokyo, I felt at home. When I was in the States, I felt reasonably at home. I felt more at home in Japan, actually, than I did in the United States, strangely enough, because there was such a sort of a feeling of a kinness between ourselves and the Japanese. And I don't wish to live in a supranational European Union. Let's just think about what European Union actually means. It means a political union. It has not one, but 5 presidents. And of course, none of them are British, but we'll put that on one side. There's the Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, European Parliament President, Martin Schulz, European Council President, Donald Tusk. There's the ECB President, Mario Draghi, and I don't envy him his job one iota. And there's a Eurogroup President called Jeroen Dijsselbloem. I could never pronounce Dutch, so forgive me. But the European Union legislates on a vast range of subjects that affect this country. Perhaps that matters to people, perhaps it doesn't, but it matters to me. I think these decisions should be made in Westminster, where I can actually vote MPs out if I so feel inclined. I can't do that with the European Parliament, and I can't do that with the Commission, which actually has a huge influence on legislation within the European Union. It sort of leaves some of the subjects: taxation, employment, social policy, financial services, trade, competition, industrial policy, state aids, energy, the environment, enterprise, justice and home and affairs. It just goes on and on and on. And through the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, the EU controls agriculture, it controls fisheries. And I think that this legislation is extremely important. It was a decade ago that Lord Treesman, who was then a Foreign Office Minister, he said that about half of the UK legislation that influences business and likewise institutions stemmed from legislation agreed in Brussels, about half. So it wasn't trivial, and that was his estimate, not mine. So, and let's be honest, EU law has supremacy, and the European Court of Justice is the Supreme Court in this land. It's not the House of Lords, it's not the Supreme Court of Justice, none of those things, it's the European Court of Justice. So, and of course, last but not least, the free movement of people, which is part of the single market, and I know David touched on this. The single market comprises the free movement of goods and services and capital and labour. Well, the problem is with having the free movement of people across the borders of the European Union is that you don't have control over your borders. Now, again, that may matter to you, or it may not, but it matters to an incredible number of people in this country. It's an issue, and you can't get away from it. Now, of course, as I say, I shall be voting to leave on the 23rd of June, which will come as no surprise to people in this audience. But even if there's a Remain vote, I suspect this issue of Britain's relationship with the European Union will not go away, because it's been a troubled relationship, quite frankly, ever since I remember right back in the beginning when we joined the European Union in 1974. Now, Brexiters, and I am one, let's be frank, are rightly challenged. What sort of relationship would we have with the EU if there was Brexit? And I shall say more about that in a minute. But what I always say to the Remainers when they say that to me, because I always like to have a sort of counter question, this is very important in life, I said, will you tell me where you think the European Union will be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? What will it look like? Because we know, and I say this without any pleasure, there are two major crises that are, at the moment are affecting the European Union. Of course, there's the one is about the migration crisis, and I'm afraid to say I think a lot of that was stimulated by German Chancellor Merkel's comments that there'd be no upper limit on the number of refugees that could go to Germany, which was really like a green light, and I think under the circumstances has turned out to be a very cruel green light. But that particular crisis has been marked by some of the bitterest divisions and recriminations in Europe that I remember. Look at the way that Germany's had a go at Hungary and Hungary's had a go at Germany. Now, this is a reality, I'm afraid. I'm afraid it is the reality. And the other crisis, of course, is a Eurozone crisis. And I speak as somebody who always opposed the euro because I thought it was an absurdity to try and have one currency with such disparate economies when you don't have proper fiscal union, and there is not proper fiscal union. And we know some of the consequences of this rather ill-thought-through experiment in currencies, in the sense that now there are quite a few of the southern European countries in particular that since the euro began, they've suffered from low growth, high unemployment, and in the case of Greece, I think an absolutely dire situation of ongoing recession. Youth unemployment in Spain and Greece is around 50% at the moment. And I noticed in my paper today that quite a lot of people have come here to find work because they can't find work in their own countries, whether it's Italy or Greece or Spain or Portugal. I think that is an absolute condemnation of the Eurozone, that you can't even find work in your own country, so you have to go to another country to find work. What sort of success story is that? It is not a success story. And if the Eurozone is going to survive, then it will need a great deal more integration. How that will happen, we don't know. How that will affect this country, we don't know. We really just don't know. So uncertainties there may be about leaving, but my goodness me, there are uncertainties about staying. So the other thing is that Remainers, and I'm fond of them all, of course, because I always like my opponents, they're very fond of telling us that if we leave the EU, we will be isolated. We'll be some poor little country, some poor little island, bobbing around in the middle of the North Atlantic. You know, something, now I don't know if islands do bob around. I think seals may bob about, but I don't think islands do. Well, I'm afraid I think nothing could be further from the truth. We will still be a member of the Security Council of the United Nations. We'll still be at the heart of the Commonwealth, and please let's not forget about that. It's a very, very important institution, which I think has been unjustly neglected through the years. We'd still be one of the world's top economies. We're currently the 5th biggest, and I always say we're a sort of a first-ranking, second-tier global economy, and I mean global, and I use the word global as opposed to European, because that, to me, is where the 21st century is, and that is where the future is. It's not Europe, it is the world. And we'd still be a member of G7, we'd still be a member of G20, we'd still be key players in NATO. And picking up on what Daffyd was saying, I do believe that it's been NATO that has basically kept the peace since the Second World War, thank goodness, and not the European Union in itself. But more, even for me as an economist, of course, one of the other big issues was that if we leave, we will still trade with them. This notion that they wouldn't trade with us anymore is an absurdity. And so all the jobs that are associated with trade with Europe, and there could be 3 million, who knows how many jobs there are, those jobs would be safe whilst the trade was safe, and as far as I'm concerned, that trade would be safe. But I concede that people need reassurance on that, in that particular respect, and that's why I shall say a little bit more about it. It's interesting too how I noticed the IMF burst into activity yesterday by saying what an awful disruption it would be if we left the EU. And it rather made me smile because I remember 3 years ago, you know, I smile at the most peculiar things, but there we go. But Olivier Blanchard, who was the chief economist of the IMF back in 2013, said that George Osborne at that time was playing with fire with the economy because of his tough fiscal policies. Well, suffice to say, Olivier Blanchard was actually wrong. The economy did recover quite nicely, thank you, and the economy did not go down in flames. And so George Osborne, I think, should be I think he should be praised for actually sticking to his guns when he was under such a lot of criticism. But I noticed in today's press, I mean, George Osborne is no longer playing with fire, he's actually kissing Christine Lagarde, who happens to be the director of the IMF. No coincidence there. But no, there wouldn't be a terrific disruption. I think there are various economic authorities that have come out saying, yes, there would be some, and obviously businesses would have to adjust. But on the whole, it would be manageable, and it would be pretty modest. And Lord Rose of Malnewden, who's the chairman of Britain Stronger in Europe, which is the pro-Remain campaign group, is on the record of saying, nothing is going to happen if we come out of Europe. It's not going to be a step change, or somebody's going to turn the lights off, and we're all suddenly not going to find we can't go to France. It's going to be a gentle process. And I think Lord Rose is right. I think he's absolutely right. There'll be changes. Yes, of course there will be. But it won't be some dreadful, dreadful shock either to ourselves or the European Union. Now, I said that I would look I'd say a little bit more about what sort of relationship we would have if we left the European Union, particularly on the economic side, because after all, that is what I claim to know a bit more about than most other things. Let's just think, if there's a Brexit vote on the 23rd of June, what would happen? Well, immediately nothing. There'll presumably be a few political changes in government, but I will leave that to you with your own political canniness. And then after a while, when perhaps the British government and the civil service have thought about matters a little bit, and what sort of relationship they would like with the European Union, they will trigger something called Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. And Article 50 is the so-called withdrawal clause. And that says that within 2 years, unless there's some dispensation and it's extended, etc., then that's when the withdrawing country, in this case the United Kingdom, would arrange the new agreement with the European Union. So we'd have 2 years to do that. Fine. So the actual mechanics of deciding the new arrangement are there. They're in the Lisbon Treaty. Moreover, if you do look at the Lisbon Treaty and look at Article 8, it actually says something very interesting. It talks about neighbourliness, and there should be a special relationship between the EU and its neighbours, a sort of a co-prosperity area. So in other words, Lisbon doesn't just tell us about the mechanics of negotiating a new relationship, but actually the mood. It gives you the mood music. That this is about being friendly and about being neighbourly. And we would want to be neighbourly with them, and surely they would want to be neighbourly with us. There is nothing on either side, their side or our side, that would benefit if we were not neighbourly. We would be friendly, we would be neighbourly. And so I think the other thing, David obviously mentioned Canada and Norway. Let's be clear about this. We're not Canada, we're not Norway. They're splendid countries, by the way. Please, I'm not running them down. We are Britain. And we've got 2 or 3 things in our favour that these countries have not got. Firstly, of course, that we are a very, very much bigger economy and much more significant than they are. And I'm not bragging, it's just a fact of life. And of course, the second one is that because we've been in the European Union for such a long time, and its predecessors, then we're already very closely harmonized with them, and that would make the negotiations for a new relationship much easier than, say, the one with Canada. The analogy with Canada or with Norway or Switzerland or anybody else, frankly, is not a close one. Now, of course, the key thing, I've talked about trade and I've talked about jobs, and I do think these are absolutely central. So what would the trade relationship be? And I don't know if there are any people here who study economics. This privileged subject that I have studied all my life. But I think there would be a trade deal, of course there would. But if for some freak reason there weren't one, then we would continue to trade with the European Union as we trade with many other countries around the planet under so-called World Trade Organization rules. And this in itself would not be a disaster. My goodness me, I just don't go for this Armageddon thing at all. Because after all, a good proportion of world trade is actually under what I call vanilla WTO rules. Anglo-Chinese trade is. And where I know there are some downsides to that, it's quite clear over the last decade that Anglo-Chinese trade has been a downside more buoyant than Anglo-EU trade. And why has that been? It's because of commercial reasons, it's because of the markets. But of course, if there was no trade deal, then we would find that we'd face something called the Common External Tariff, which is the Common External Tariff of the EU's customs union. I hope I'm still remaining reasonably interesting, but what the importance of this is that British exporters to the EU, if they exported a car, for example, they'd have to pay a tax, they'd have to pay a tariff. And on cars, it's about 10%. The average is only about 1 or 2, but on cars, it's about 10%. So really, it would be sensible for commercial reasons to arrange that trade deal. Now, I believe that trade deal would be fairly expeditiously done. I don't think it had gone for years and years and years. I really don't. After all, we would have very considerable clout in the negotiations. I don't know if any of you follow the trade figures. I follow them avidly every month. And the 2015 figures came out recently for goods deficit. We have a goods deficit with the other countries of the European Union of about 90 billion. 90 billion pounds, that's about 4 or 5% of GDP. 30% alone was with Germany. The Germans sell a great deal more things to us than we do to them, which probably doesn't surprise anybody in this audience when they see the number of Audis and Volkswagens and Mercedes-Benz going down the road. Now, I want that to continue. We all want that to continue. And moreover, so do the German exporters want that to continue. Under no circumstance would any German exporter want any disruption to their trade. And I was going to say that the German government is very supportive of its manufacturing industry. And if it felt the German industry was wanting something, my goodness, they'd move heaven and earth to get that effected. And in fact, I will quote someone called Heiner Flassbeck, which I suppose is not he's not been on sort of a celebrity knockout or anything like that, but he's the former state secretary at the German Ministry of Finance. And Heiner Flassbeck said, "We would not erect barriers to British trade. By the way, Germany is, for example, benefiting very much from that trade. So Germany would not impose any kind of protectionism, any kind of barriers to Britain." And I think that would tell you what the German attitude to this trade would be. And obviously the EU has got 27 other countries, but Germany is a mightily influential one. So, as I say, I think a trade deal would be agreed fairly expeditiously. And I would make 3 other points about this. Firstly, I would not expect the government to negotiate the free movement of labour, free movement of people. I just wouldn't expect them to do that. I may be wrong, but given the noise they make about trying to control immigration, I wouldn't expect them to do it. And it isn't there's no necessity on us or on the British government to negotiate that. The fact that Norway has the free movement of labour is because it's in the European Economic Area. I wouldn't see us remaining in the European Economic Area. And Switzerland has that as well because they have a specific bilateral agreement. The second thing is about the regulations, which we've already heard about. I have obviously no doubt that if you want to export to the European Union and you're not in it, then you would have to comply with the product regulations. Of course you would. The safety regulations, of course you would. If you export anything to the United States of America at the moment, you have to apply and comply with their product regulations and their safety regulations. They're not going to buy some kit of aerospace kit, if they think it's going to drop out the sky. They're simply not going to do it. But what is interesting about a lot of these product regulations and product standards is a lot of them are increasingly decided internationally. And I think that's all to the good, all to the good. So I have no problems with that at all. As when it comes to other sorts of regulations, well, that's a different matter, because obviously China doesn't apply or comply with the social and employment regulations of the EU when it exports televisions to us. No, of course it doesn't. It just makes sure those televisions are complying with the product regulations. And the third thing I would say is that would be absolutely no need to contribute to the EU budget at all to get this so-called access to the single market. Nearly every other country on the planet, with possible exception of Switzerland and Norway, and they do it on a voluntary basis, really, they don't pay for access to the single market. It just isn't the case. Now, there are one or two other things I would probably skip on. But I do think that further out, if then there is Brexit, of course, I would like there to be Brexit. Who knows? It might be in 2 or 3 years' time, if the vote goes well for us on the 23rd of June. Then I think the economic prospects further out are actually would look better. They could be considerably better for this country and for everybody who lives in this country than if we stayed in. And there are 4 reasons for saying that. I think the first is that whatever you think of all the social and employment regulations, sometimes business does absolutely complain about this. It's a political judgment. Let's be honest about this, a political judgment. But some of the regulations that perhaps business does find most irksome could be repealed. That would give them a little competitiveness boost, but I don't make a big issue of that. And you know what? I don't think there would be a particularly big bonfire of regulations if we left. The second thing I would say is, and this to me is much more important, is that we would be able to negotiate our own trade deals with the... Shall I wrap up? Yes. With our own trade deals with the other countries of the globe. The third thing is, of course, if we could have an immigration policy, it could be non-discriminatory between EU and non-EU countries. And the fourth thing is that we would actually benefit from saving our net contributions to the budget, which amount to about £10 billion, which is better than a kick in the pants, to use a phrase. And I will now conclude, Ian, because you would like me to, and I will do everything I'm told. But, you know, I do remember the 1970s when we joined the communities. I remember it very well, and it was a time when this country had lost an empire and not yet found a role. It seemed a very discredited and demoralized country. And we joined the European community in a way that some of its dynamism would brush off on us. Well, that actually didn't happen. But that was the 1970s. You know, that was a long time ago. The world has changed dramatically since then. This country's changed. It's got more of its pep back from the 1970s, although there are a few bumps on the road. And the European Union and Europe, continental Europe, has changed dramatically. At that time, 40 years ago, it seemed to be the go, go, go part of the world economy. It was growing fast and its future looked good. That dynamism has gone. And we now have, instead, a relatively slow-growing part of the world. And that, I'm afraid, will continue, if not get worse, because of the demographics within the European community. And as I've tried to say, I do think that, for democratic reasons, there are every good reason for saying we should leave the EU. As I've said orally several times in my speech, I should be voting to leave. And so I beg to oppose the motion, just in case you haven't noticed, but I beg to oppose the motion. This House considers that the UK should remain a member of the EU. It's time to be free.
Thank you. Michael Mitchell will second Daffyd. Michael is a politics student.
Good afternoon, everybody. So apologies if I mess this up. I've never done public speaking on this scale before, so it's a bit scary. But before I start, I want to say thank you to the team who organised this event, giving me the opportunity to and the honour to second and support a speaker as prolific as Daffyd, and giving me the opportunity to debate this topic with my opposing counterparts, Ruth and Lewis. So I'm not going to stand here and say the EU is some sort of perfect institution, because it's not. And like everything, reforms are always needed for improvement, because everything in the world has the opportunity to improve. But taking a utilitarian approach, it's, for me, and the reason why I consider myself a pro-European, is about weighing up the pros and cons of being a member of this political club and reaching a conclusion accordingly to what best suits Britain's economic and political interests and what is best for the social security and well-being of all the British people. So after considering that, the overwhelming decision for me is that Great Britain is better off in the European Union, and the prospect of Brexit is, in my opinion, a huge threat to our international prestige and to the security of all citizens of this country, which we have enjoyed for so long. So for me, there are three main arguments in favour of remaining in the EU and the pros of our membership, and I'll try and keep all the mind-boggling statistics to a minimum if possible. So firstly, there is what I would say the core economic argument, the one which is probably the most intelligible and comprehensive argument to present in a debate like this. So the EU is the largest and one of the most lucrative single markets in the world, opening up trade channels for British businesses, exporters and importers, to a total of around 510 million consumers. There's nothing else like it in the world, and almost completely free of tariffs and regulation. And this opens up amazing opportunities for us to connect and trade with Europe, opportunities which we are firmly grasped, as now over 50% of our trade is now with the EU bloc, a single market which has now become enshrined in our nation's trading habits and our nation's economic health. Trading habits which have forced a collection of previously hostile nation-states into a network of healthy and friendly trading relationships, off which we have become more wealthy and prosperous. And it is no coincidence that a continent which has witnessed two devastating wars in the past 100 years has enjoyed relative peace since the Treaty of Rome in 1958 and the establishment of the European Economic Community, which in 2012 actually won the Nobel Peace Prize precisely for that. Economic interdependence has therefore brought about peace and has in the process forged an inseparable relationship between us and the European Union, with many jobs now completely dependent on our membership. We are also more attractive to investors by being within the European common market. People want to invest here, people want to set up businesses here, because precisely we're a member of the EU bloc. Brexit would therefore, in my opinion, be an extreme economic risk, one that simply isn't worth taking for the sake of what I would call dogmatism and pre-EU nostalgia. Now, this leads me to the political argument. What advantage does being an EU member give us in terms of political power and international prestige? Well, I would argue a huge one. By being part of the European Union, we can operate globally as part of a common bloc. Our head of state has a seat at the European Commission, where we can defend our own interests and play a part on the global stage with other European heads of state. And this appeals to all my left-wing tendencies, that we can achieve more by our common endeavour and be safer together than we can simply by being on our own. So being part of the EU, therefore, enables us to both stand proud on the world stage and work with our allies. Voting in is therefore both the patriotic and the sensible option. And finally, this leads me to the social and cultural opportunities of staying in the EU. And they are massive. However, I will just give you a few quickly because I'm running out of time a little bit. And I want to talk more about why the EU is good for students after this. So the EU, through its directives and legislation, research I've done, has brought about, and just a few things, cleaner beaches and rivers, restrictions on air pollution, freedom to live, work and travel across all EU member states, cheaper mobile charges, greater consumer protection on food labelling, bans on growth hormones and harmful food additives, restrictions on landfill dumping, legislation for equal pay between men and women originally enshrined in the Treaty of Rome, the assurance that all workers will receive at least 4 weeks paid leave in a year, foreign exchange and study under the EU Erasmus programme, and many, many more. The list is endless, and this is how the EU has played a part in shaping a fairer society for us. So, nearly done now. And now, I want to end with explaining some details about why students like me and you benefit overwhelmingly from EU membership, and people living in Chester specifically. And this is courtesy of some help from Callum Hodgson, President of the Labour Society. He gave me some help on this. So, according to research conducted by the organisation Universities UK, EU students at UK universities generate 3.7 billion for the UK economy and support around 35,000 jobs across all corners of the country. EU students coming here spent 220 million on university campuses in 2011 to 2012, which is money going directly into our facilities, generating better opportunities and investing more in British education. And vice versa, UK students like us now, because of the EU Erasmus programme, have the opportunity to study abroad under EU schemes. The Now Food Centre, just next to the Westminster Centre, was partly funded by EU Regional Development Fund. For the North West alone, EU students coming here to study generate 221.6 million for the local regional economy, the region where we study, live and enjoy our university life. And all this means that by being a member of the European Union, we can attract the best and the brightest to come and contribute and participate at our universities. So this means we can open our arms to the globe and to the international community, rather than removing ourselves from it. So after all this, and finally, I urge people to vote to stay in the EU. And instead of taking this huge gamble and risking a serious economic crisis, why don't we take the patriotic, the sensible, and the better option for the world? Why don't we stay in the EU and fight to change the institution from within? And it can be done, and it has been done before. So let's just be bold and do that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I now call upon Lewis Charlton, who is a second-year law student.
Good afternoon. Following what has already been said about leaving the EU, I will be focusing on two key areas: immigration and the notion of free movement of people, and moving on to the British sovereignty. I would like to begin with reference to Cheyenne. The Cheyenne Agreement is often criticised by nationalists and Eurosceptics such as the French National Front, the Dutch Freedom Party and the UK Independence Party. They say it is an open door for migrants and criminals. A number of EU countries imposed temporary labour market restrictions on workers from the 8 of the East European countries that joined in 2004. The UK saw an unexpected surge in migrants from these states, the majority in Poland. Germany reimposed controls on its borders with Austria, after a record number of migrants travelled to southern Germany from Hungary via Austria. Moving back to the UK, free movement of labour has caused problems of overcrowding in UK cities. The UK's population is set to rise to around 70 million. Theresa May has recently stated that more than a third of all housing demand in Britain was caused by immigration. She also made the point that without this demand, house prices could be 10% lower in 20 years. This is so important. I'm sure in 20 years, many of us will want to buy our own house, and I'm sure many of us will want it 20% cheaper, 10% cheaper. The concern is that the UK is powerless to prevent large-scale immigration because EU rules allow free movement. Due to this surge, £11 billion has been spent on repatriating migrants to their countries of origin since 2000. A further £1 billion has been blown on Europe-wide coordination efforts to secure European borders. This money could have been spent on integrating those migrants into European society. I would like to move on to the EU sovereignty now and start with research conducted by the Taxpayers Alliance. It found that there were currently 16,000 EU acts in force, and in between 1998 and 2007, there was a gain of 9,000 EU laws, and in 2007, 3,000 EU laws became UK law, while only 993 EU regulations were repealed. To put that in simple terms, that was a gain of 2,017 extra laws that we have no say against. It should also be noted that the Lithuanian government, which has been counting since it joined in 2005, states that the amount of laws affecting it directly from the EU is about 30%. The German Federal Justice Ministry stated that between 1998 and 2004, 23,000 legal acts were adopted in Germany, or 80% of all legal acts were EU origin. This information was then used to calculate that approximately 84% of all German laws originate in Brussels. We can't let this happen to England. Returning to the UK and more to British sovereignty, Britain's membership of the European Union is unconstitutional. It causes Her Majesty the Queen to be in breach of her coronation oath, in which she promised to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland according to their respective laws and customs. I'd like to end with a quote from Professor Anthony King, and in his book, The British Constitution, he observed that not only did Parliament cease to be sovereign, Britain itself ceased to be an old-fashioned sovereign state. The fact of being a member of the EU permeates almost the whole of the British government to a far greater extent than most Britons seem to realise. This is why I urge you to leave the EU so we can take back the money they steal from us and take back our sovereignty that the EU Parliament take away from us. Thank you very much.
Okay, any questions? Gentleman right at the back with the white tie.
Hi, my name is Rayson. I'm a student here. I want to talk to the people who are against us leaving the EU. You've said a lot of points, but I just want to ask some of your points that you've said around. For example, when you talked about security, and yet you guys don't even talk about how the security in EU, in the 1st of January, we had massive attacks in Cologne, and because those was a massive PR disaster, sort of like the German government were trying to cover it all up, so that it doesn't seem like as if we are going against the migrants, right? And then also, when you're talking about the EU, Turkey recently just managed to bully the EU for them to give them funding and also allow free movement of the Turkish people without visas into the EU, simply because the EU didn't want to have economic migrants coming into their countries, or because of the disasters that has been happening all over, right? And then you talked about the environment, right? And saying that staying in the EU will help us protect the environment. But then you're forgetting one thing, that the EU currently is in discussion with America to talk about the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which will allow companies in the United States to be able to sue governments when they've got policies that can hurt their profits, margins. And then that means that all of this TTIP will also mean that it will have universal environmental laws, which are quite different, because we know in America they've got quite lax environmental laws based on right here in the Europe. And also, you talked about also the businesses lacking business investment, trying to invest here in Britain because it's a block to go into the EU. But I'd like to put out Google, Apple, Amazon, all those companies are in the EU, but they don't want to set up their headquarters, their European headquarters here in Britain, even though most of their profits come in Britain, because they want to go in places like Ireland and Luxembourg, where there are cheaper taxes. That way they can avoid paying tax. So for us leaving the EU, won't that mean that we'll be able to gain more money from those taxes that we're actually losing from all those companies, which are also using this European free movement also? And also we're talking about the free...
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think that's enough to be chewing on for just a bit. Daffyd, would you like
Yes,
to thank you very much for that. Sorry.
As there are a number of people trying to get in with questions, I'll try and respond very, very briefly to the points made, if I can remember the 4 points that were raised. On the last point with regard to companies that are moving around within the EU or outside the EU in order to avoid paying their tax, that is something which at this very point in time the EU is trying to bring in regulations in order to control that. And it must be done. It's absolutely unacceptable that people, companies, corporations can choose whether or not to pay corporation tax, and we need to get rules. And it should have been done before now. So let's me accept entirely. Everything isn't totally rosy in the garden. There needs to be action on that. With regard to the TTIP North American agreement, if we're outside the EU, we're very much more going to be at the mercy, to my mind, of the American and the mid-Atlantic influences that are coming across. The EU need not sign up to something that it does not accept. And the social agenda, which could be under threat from some aspects of TTIP, is something that we've got to stand up against. It is now a matter that is subject of very great controversy within the European Parliament, and decisions have to be taken. But I have every faith that we can withstand that just as well within a EU framework as we can if we're outside. With regard to migrants, if I just touch on Turkey to start with, people flag up Turkey as a possibility of coming into the European Union. The UK, of course, would have a veto on that. The one country could block the access of Turkey into the European Union. With regard to the way that the German government particularly have been dealing with migrants, it's a mess. But look, are we more likely to get a sensible resolution to the migrant problem if we're working together with countries rather than working every country separately, as some states, regrettably, within the European Union are wanting to do, such as Hungary and Poland? We need cooperation on an international level within Europe to handle this problem, and it is a problem that is coming to Europe because physically it's to Europe that these people are coming, and we need to resolve it. And the fact that we're going to be outside the European Union doesn't mean that we don't have to have a movement of people. I heard the comments have been made, but if we are going to have a trading area there, then almost certainly we're going to be pressurised to have the movement of people within Europe to that end. And I've just tried to touch on the several subjects that have been raised.
Thank you. Ruth?
Well, I mean, I think on the migrants, I made it very clear in my initial remarks that I think the whole thing is an utter shambles and has gone from one crisis to another. And what worries me, I hear what David says about the countries of Europe working together, but the debate so far has been one of bitterness and recrimination. I find it very depressing. If anything, this is pulling Europe apart. So I'm deeply depressed about it, and I have no solutions, and I don't know where the solutions are going to come from. But I know one thing, if we were outside the European Union, at least we'd have a better opportunity of controlling our own borders. And what is so worrying at the moment, that there are quite a lot of fake IDs coming in from, say, the Ukraine, never mind what's happening to a lot of the Middle Eastern refugees. They have fake IDs, that Polish IDs, and they can come straight into this country. Whereas if there were no freedom of movement of people, we'd at least be able to control that. And I think that is an important development. When it comes to inward investment and companies coming to this country in order to have access to the EU's single market, I think there are two things to say there. Firstly, companies come to this country because there are all sorts of reasons, all sorts of commercial reasons, not least of all because we have an excellent workforce, an excellent workforce to be in your good selves, etc., etc. I'm trying to get round you, but never mind. But but joking apart, companies come here for a whole variety of reasons, mainly because we are a business-friendly country and the tax regime is favourable, and we have a business-friendly government. Those things wouldn't change. And when it comes to trade with the European Union, as I said in my comments, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that we'd come to some very favourable trade arrangement with the other countries of the EU. It's in their interests.
Ruth, the questioner and Daffyd pointed out the method of coping with the inherent dangers of overarching corporate American undemocratic intrusiveness. Are we better prepared for that within the EU or not?
I presume we're talking about TTIP.
Yes.
I mean, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, bloody. I'm not very keen on TTIP, and I'm not even sure whether it's going to happen, to be quite honest. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And then if we want to have our own trade relationship with the US, I think it'd be a straight vanilla tariff agreement, probably.
Are we likely to have more power to resist corporate America within the EU or
Well, we can
on
decide
our
what we
own?
want to do with them. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, corporate America, bring it on. But what I think TTIP is the worry is about the fact...
The ability of American companies to sue.
Correct. I mean,
when they feel their corporate interests are encroached upon
Yes,
by the democratic effects of
exactly.
being in the EU.
Exactly. Well, we needn't agree to that at all. But, I mean, please don't condemn America because of TTIP. I think TTIP is unfortunate because America is the biggest single overseas investor in this country. And by the way, we're the biggest single overseas investor in the United States of America. It works both ways. And you'd certainly want to encourage US investment here. You'd certainly want to do that. And no doubt they would like to encourage our investment in their country. But this is what international trade's about.
Thank you. Next question. Gentleman in the plaid shirt.
So I'm Andy, and I guess it's mainly to Remain. Chair, do you think David Cameron can stay on as Prime Minister if Britain leave the EU?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch your question.
Do the Remain panel believe that David Cameron should stay on if Britain leave the EU?
We haven't paid him to answer that question.
No, you're pointing at me. I'm sure Ruth and other colleagues will have an opinion on this. I mean, we are now in a fixed-term Parliament situation, which is a relatively new development for the United Kingdom, which means that we don't automatically get a general election if Cameron were to resign. Now, if there was a general election, I'm pretty sure I know where I'd be pressing. But in reality, I think he'll find it fairly difficult to remain credible as a Conservative leader if he has lost this referendum that he's gone into. Now, then, I think that is a secondary issue. The primary issue, I believe, is getting the decision right with regard to being part of the European Union or not. If that comes the right way, then Cameron presumably will continue until 2020 or shortly before and will step down, and the Conservative Party will sort out the next leader. It'll be interesting to see how all party leaders do between now and then.
Well, the delicious prospect for those who dislike Mr Cameron is that he's already announced he's going before the next general election anyway. So it's just a question of will he fall or was he pushed? Ruth?
I think if it was a leave vote, I couldn't see how he could stay on. I really couldn't see how he could stay on. But what is worrying for the Conservative Party is that, of course, it's now completely split. I mean, what I find fascinating about all this is that so many of the MPs within the Tory party have actually voted to say they're going. I think it's certainly a majority of those who've not got jobs. And I think, surprisingly enough, there were quite a few of the cabinet ministers who said they support Brexit. You've got Michael Gove, who's very articulate, a very well thought of, respected person. I like Michael hugely. And you obviously think it's hilariously funny.
Well, he was the Education Secretary, so it's a bit of a hard sell in here.
Well, he was a very dreadful Education Secretary. No, but joking apart. Well, he's mixed, let's put it that way. Is that better? Oh, never mind. But the point is, he's quite an influential Conservative, should we put it that way? Yeah, and then, of course, you've got Priti Patel and you've got Chris Grayling. All this is just really storing up trouble for the current Prime Minister, whether there's a Brexit vote or whether there's a Remain vote, in my view. And as you said, Cameron has said he's going to go before the end of this Parliament. I don't think there'll be a general election. I quite agree. It's a fixed-term Parliament. And it's really just a matter of when he chooses to... give up.
Is there going to be anything left of the Conservative Party by the end of the
Well, there's going to be two bits.
Be at the end of June. That's what they said about the Titanic.
For the Conservative Party, they are very tribal. I mean, speaking as a member of the Conservative Party myself, it is really quite extraordinary how tribal they are. And so perhaps they will come together. And I say this again without any pleasure, but I do actually wish the opposition party were better, because I think that would sharpen up the government as well.
Well, I think the opposition surprised quite a lot of people in its efficacy, really, recently. But anyway, we'll move. Michael,
We're not talking politics today.
Well, you've said most of it, but I think that, like David and Ruth has said, that he'll be under so much pressure from his backbenchers, from ministers within his cabinet, that it'll be almost impossible for him to stay if there is a Leave campaign. And it's just strikingly similar to the situation in the 1990s under John Major, where he was his leadership was plagued by infighting about Europe, and it's just
he called his colleagues bastards and told them to put up or shut up.
He did, yeah.
And he won.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, Lewis.
As a Conservative member as well, I disagree with David's comments about his credibility being tarnished. If there is a Leave campaign, are we going to ask every member of the Conservative Party who voted to stay and to leave their post as well, or just the one that was the face? David Cameron was asked to pick a side. He's asked to get this campaign from the public. That's what we asked for. That's what he's done. We shouldn't ask him to leave simply because he didn't get the answer he wanted. So I think he should. I think he will stay, personally.
If there's a Brexit vote, no.
Good.
Okay.
I don't think Cameron will leave.
I have disunity on the left. Okay, next question, please.
Very loyal.
Gentleman here.
All these gentlemen. Where are the ladies? You.
You spoke about immigration, and I'd just like to raise a couple of points about that. Immigration is a two-way street in Europe. We can move freely in Europe just as they can move freely here. Immigration is a net gain to this country, and some of the key institutions like the NHS, which is struggling, would not survive without immigrants who are some of the most talented doctors that we have in this country working. And also, Lewis briefly mentioned housing, and how's the housing crisis. And I would argue that's not so much about immigration as a governmental housing policy and not building enough affordable houses. So,
Ruth, do you want to kick off?
On immigration, I think I said very quickly towards the end of my speech, I personally would have quite a liberal immigration policy, but it would be non-discriminatory between the EU and the non-EU countries. What I find extraordinary working in the City of London is that banks are always complaining that they can't get the visas for non-EU workers. So it would be a matter of having a point system, more like Australia, where you decide on the people depending on what sort of skills they've got. And so I take your point. I think the country does benefit overall from immigration. It would be a great mistake, I think, to just go clamp down on it. But at least if we're outside the EU, we can decide where people come from. So it'd be non-discriminatory between Poland, and I've got Polish friends, by the way, please don't think I'm anti-Polish, I'm not. Or whether they came from Portugal, or they come from Australia, the United States, Canada, or India. It would be completely non-discriminatory. I think that to me is a win.
So you'd say yes to immigration on the basis of economic need?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I've touched on the immigration thing already. I believe that there are many, many skills and many shortages that are answered by people that come over here. And certainly there are hundreds of thousands of people from the United Kingdom working in various parts of continental Europe. But can I pick up the housing point, which I think is an important one? What we're seeing down in London, and that's knocking on to other parts of the UK, is a housing market that has gone totally out of control. And this isn't by European individuals and institutions buying up housing. It's by oligarchs and people from the oil country and that sort of thing buying up whole blocks of flats, and some of them just standing empty. And the price is just going through the roof. There's no chance in hell of any ordinary working person being able to live there. And you're finding the pressure then moving from London through to Watford and to Milton Keynes and to Swindon, and no doubt knocking through to the northwest here as well, as it is to Wales. And it makes things so very, very difficult for young people, so different to our time, when it was possible. My first house I bought for £5,500 in Hounslow. You know, you just think of the situation now. It's just gone out of control. And there needs to be a coherent approach to this, which includes the planning system and the coherent agenda in planning to ensure that there are houses coming on stream at affordable prices. And if necessary, and I don't like this as an approach, but it may be necessary to get rent control. And I know that has gone wrong in the past, and there were periods of Rasmussen and all the rest. But without rent control, in certain parts of South East England, there is going to be total chaos. And something has to be done urgently, otherwise it's your generation that's going to be paying the price.
Are we allowed to discuss this?
No.
I was going to say rent
price and income
rent
policies
control would make it worse.
Something, a nasty echo from the 1970s.
But that's enough about housing.
Yes, it is. But, I mean, how otherwise? When you get rentals that are running to several £100 a week in the London area, how on earth can an ordinary person live?
Make it worse because you cut back on the supply.
Well,
I mean, the key thing is...
let's get another answer then.
You cut back on the supply. But the key thing is you put your finger on it. The planning system has to change big time.
Yes, I agree.
Because
but is this an issue concerning Europe?
Well,
No.
it's concerning the fact that we've got a rapidly rising population, which we've got a rising population, particularly in London. I mean, London is, if I may say so, exceptional. And, of course, a lot of the inward migrants are European. But, I mean, just on housing, I mean, there's no question about it. You just need a massive push on supply side.
Thank you.
Which is absolutely nothing to do with Europe at all.
Look, don't attack me.
You're doing a good job there, Ian. Don't worry.
Referring to your point about immigration, how it is a two-way street, and yes, many immigrants that come into the UK do bring benefits, but there are also the people that come in and don't bring benefits, as there are people who leave the UK and don't bring take benefits with them. So there must be that, as Ruth said, that point system where we only bring in the people we need, so that will help with the NHS and the housing situation. So we control who we bring in, who we leave, so we keep the business within Britain and not leaving into EU.
But can I just take up the point, and not so much what you were saying then, but in the context that Ruth said it. Do you seriously believe that we're going to be able to get a total market of that 500 million people without accepting a free movement of people within it? I don't think it's on. I don't think it's credible in the least.
Yes, it's economic.
No, I mean, we've had leader after leader in Europe making it absolutely clear that that is price. If you're a member of the club, there are rules. And the rules include a free movement of people, which is fundamental to the European vision. And if you're throwing that out, you're also signing yourself out from being a fully integrated member of that market. And we'll pay the price in economic terms.
Could I just say this? Do you think China has freedom of movement of people with the European Union? No. Does the United States? No. Which is the biggest single trade partner of the European Union? It's the United States of America.
Yes, but...
sorry, forgive me. You have to distinguish between sheer trade, which is goods and services, which is a single market, goods and services, capital and labour, and labour, between the goods and services and labour.
Why on earth do you think that companies such as Airbus and these are warning of the dangers to themselves? Siemens and other companies are dangers to their future if we pull out. It's because they see the impact this is going to have. They are the people who are concerned about the future of their businesses. And we've got to listen to them.
Do you know what? I'd like to take money on this and say that if there's a Brexit, if we leave, none of those companies will leave.
I've got some colleagues who will do betting office work later.
Why should they? They'd still have trade. What's the problem?
Indicating any member of staff in particular.
I say I have a few sort of niggly problems with the whole points-based system. Whereas it doesn't seem viable to me if a refugee from, I don't know, Syria or an economic migrant from North Africa wants to come to Britain, then what points does he have to speak of, and how would he or she be able to get into the country?
Well, if you're talking about asylum, that's a different issue from economic migrants, and you should keep them separate. Because if there's somebody who's fleeing Syria because it's such an absolute hell of a place, let's be frank about this, that would be asylum. Because they haven't got a safe country to go back to. If you're talking about economic migrants, I think this is where you bring in a point system and decide that you choose people according to the skills that it can provide, and you specify what those skills are. Government, decide what they are.
How do you clearly distinguish between economic migrants and refugees? Because, you could see some people living in an unofficial war zone
If you think the country is seriously unstable, then you are talking about an asylum situation. If it's not, then you're not.
So people living in, I don't know, Libya, people living in Somalia, people living... Would they
Well,
all be
arguably, you could treat them as asylum seekers.
asylum seekers?
Asylum seekers.
So what about people living in other countries which are
Depends whether they're
ravaged by poverty?
Well, not poverty, no. If it's a reasonably stable country, I mean, the argument is if you sent them back, they would be under threat of life. Their lives
But
would be under
isn't
threat.
starvation a threat to life?
Exactly.
No, but that wouldn't be in this particular respect. No, as I understand, I mean, I take your point, but as far as the asylum system was concerned, I don't think they buy that at all.
Right. Next question. Now, the woman on the front here, please. That's incredibly civilised of you. Matt. And as one of my students, I'm very glad to see his hand going up. So, Matt.
Now, this is a general question for all members of the panel. On the side of Brexit, there are currently 3 main campaigns: Grassroots Out, Vote Leave and Leave.eu. Do the members of this panel feel that by having 3 campaigns, all giving different various kinds of voices, viewpoints and that, could that potentially distort and fragment the campaign and the message that the Out campaign is trying to put across?
Yes, well, thinking back to recent referendum campaigns that went a little wrong because of the way they were organised, I'm thinking particularly in Scotland, that the way that the Remain campaign was conducted on a kind of multi-party basis caused a lot of anxiety amongst the Scottish people, did it not? Mm. So have the various sides been well organised in this engagement or not?
It's something that exercises me considerably. Let's put it that way. But on the Remain side, we'll start with the Remain side first, and then I'll go on to the Leave side. You've got Britain Stronger in Europe, which is Lord Rose and Will Self, I think. Will, what's his name? Straw. Will Straw.
Will Straw, yeah.
And on the Leave side, as the gentleman was saying, or I can't see him, you've got Grassroots Out, you've got Leave.eu, and you've got Vote Leave. There will be a designated out group, probably tomorrow. And then it will be for that...
Is that as a result of this discussion? Or?
No. I would like to
Get on with it.
I would like to think so, Ian, but alas, no. I think it's something to do with the Electoral Commission, and they'll be announcing it tomorrow. I suspect, and I've got no inside information on this, that it will actually be Vote Leave that will lead the Leave campaign, but Leave.eu and Grassroots Out, they tend to be more sort of by their names, they tend to be more grassroots organisations, where Vote Leave is more of a Westminster-based organisation. Mm-hmm. I think really, once there's a designated group for the Leave campaign, they will focus round that designated group.
You could forgive the electorate for thinking that it looks disunited, fragmented and competitive.
You could certainly forgive the electorate for thinking that.
Yeah. Okay, well, and will that change before June?
But I put it this way, I'm in favour of competition.
Oh, you are, yes, as an economist, I know that.
Let the best man win. But if it, as I say, once there has been one designated, I think they will coalesce around that particular group.
But this is the one big opportunity that people of your political persuasion have had in 40 years, and they look like they're fluffing it as organisationally.
I don't think they're fluffing it. I think there's still a lot to play for. And I know we've been discussing, I've been discussing this wretched issue most of my life. But for most people, I don't think they have. And the campaign really only starts in earnest, I would have thought, in the last 5-6 weeks, if that. Once we get through the May elections, once that's out of the way, I think. And by then, as I say, I think the Leave campaign will have sorted itself out.
Daffyd.
Well, very briefly, the Yes campaign, to stay in the Stronger In, has the advantage of being focused on why it is wanting to retain what is there, and remarkably has most of the Tory cabinet, half the Tory MPs, perhaps more or less the entirety of the Labour Party, half a dozen MPs seem to be against it, the whole of the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party, etc. An overwhelming block of people leading the political scene. On the other side, when the launch of the Out took place in Westminster Hall, somewhere close to there, we had the remarkable situation where we had Farage, we had George Galloway, and
I was there.
you were there, right?
We didn't know Mr. Galloway was going to come.
No, and now we've got Boris Johnson. Boris,
like the island of Dr.
Boris,
Moreau.
Farage and Galloway. Now then, that's a pretty disparate lot. In whose hands are you going to put the future of these islands? I really ask you.
Well,
I
that
agree.
is a very interesting triumvirate, is it not? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is undermining the validity of the Out campaign. I mean, you've got Vote Leave, Leave.eu, Grassroots Out, Labour Leave, and it's a bit like, and I know many people have said this before, but it's a bit like the People's Front of Judea, isn't it? And it's getting a bit ridiculous, and I just think, for the sake of democracy and for the sake of a healthy democracy, maybe a bit of cooperation would be beneficial for everybody. For example, when George Galloway came on the stage, they ended up booing him and he ended up walking out, and it doesn't seem to me like that's healthy for democracy as a whole. If one side is so disunited and not offering an effective opponent.
Can I add one brief thing from experience of a referendum that we had in Wales 4 years ago? The anti-side, all four parties were in favour of a yes vote there. The anti-side were unable to coalesce and lost out on the right to have the free post of the leaflets to every household. And because they couldn't have it, the yes side couldn't have it either. And it was a total mess. So there is, in democratic terms, there needs to have a coherent argument, whether you agree with it or not.
But I say tomorrow, though, one of the organisations will be designated the official, and then I think things will change.
And they've put together £5 million to compete with this? Is that right?
And the rest, that's short change.
Is that small change? Well, this is an economist speaking.
Yes, I got that
Figures
as well.
are stratospheric when you go above 10,000 in academia. Lewis?
I think most of the main points have been raised, that without this collusion of one single party for the Leave campaign, that perhaps they will fall apart. So, as Ruth mentions, when it does come out, I think it will be stronger and bigger than ever.
I think they'll pull together.
The woman on the front here.
Lewis mentioned the volume of legislation that has emerged from Brussels. I was just wondering what the whole panel's thoughts are on the quality of that legislation. Mainly because I've seen in tabloids and I've seen floating around on social media a lot of misattributed laws or mistaken satire, particularly the let's all wear goggles while we play conkers type stuff, which people take for rad because they don't really understand what the laws entail. So what do you think works in terms of legislation coming from Brussels and what do you think doesn't?
Before I pass that to the panel, I think there might be two parts to the answer. One is the quality of the legislation to which you allude, and the second might be more in my field, the quality of the way it's represented in the media. So the bendy bananas, the exploding sausages, and the save our banger, etc. What do you say about that, Ruth?
I think the problem is that this legislation is made without any real control of the people I elect to Parliament. I mean, that was my initial remark, and I would like to see legislation organised in that particular way. A lot of the EU legislation, there's no doubt about it that small businesses find extremely intrusive, and that could well be repealed or amended if we left the European Union. But what would happen then, it would depend very much on what the government of the day decided to do. But for me, it is overwhelming a democratic matter that this is for the people who I can throw out of government.
Lewis, the main thrust of your argument was a constitutional one. Do you want to pick up on that?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, you talked about the volume of legislation that came from Brussels, but you didn't really talk about the quality of it.
Well, that comes hand in hand. If there's so that big of an insurge of EU law, but it's not being directly taken as worthy from us, and why do the EU seem to need to employ?
But is
so
there anything
much?
you can pick out as being particularly unworthy? Is what I'm saying.
Well, I think I can't pick out specific examples, but if of the 3,000 EU laws that became UK law, 3,000 laws obviously aren't being implemented every day, so that it shows the lack of quality the EU has when implementing laws. So it should be argued that if that is so lacklustre, then why are we subject to implementing them in the first place?
I just have to say this, that working as I do for a bank, we get a lot of the financial services regulation coming through, which is, of course, agreed by the regulatory authorities in this country. So I'm not saying this is all the EU, but my God, they're complicated. And I had the misfortune to be the chairman of the audit committee for a while, and I was very pleased when I was taken off it. The regulations were just horrendous. And I'm glad to say I've forgotten most of them.
I know bureaucracy is a French word, but it's not something to which British bureaucracy is unaccustomed, is it? David?
Michael? First?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a lot of Euro myths floating about, like specific size coffins, bendy bananas. I read one the other day about how the EU turned carrots orange or something like that. The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Express, they love that kind of thing. But overall, what did you say about the quality of the legislation? Yeah, there is always going to be a huge volume of legislation coming out if you want to run an entire continent. But I would argue the quality of legislation coming out of the EU in recent years has been much more beneficial to the way we live our society here. So, for example, equal pay between men and women. There's been constant EU legislation passed, revised, all the way several times since 1958, which has contributed a lot. Paid leave, maternity pay, all that kind of thing. That all comes from and is assured by the European Union legislation.
Yes, when you talk about the quality of the legislation, there are two aspects, of course. One is the content, and the other is the standard of legislation that is forthcoming. In terms of the content, the overwhelming majority of the content of what is legislated in the United Kingdom comes through the UK Parliament. The proportion that starts off solely from Europe is under 15%. There's an input from Europe up to about 70%, and about 30% is totally without any regard to Europe. I've sat on committees in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords dealing with some of this stuff. The biggest problem that you have in getting decent quality legislation, not the subjects, which Michael rightly underlined, there's some very important ones, but the quality, is because of the tons, the lines and pages that you have to go through of small print, and quite frankly, the democratic process is not able to cope with this within the UK or within the European Union. And secondary legislation being used even more so instead of primary legislation means that MPs in Westminster can't put amendments to the proposals. They can talk about them, but they can't change them. That's UK legislation, not European legislation. It equally applies to European legislation. So the whole argument there is to get better quality legislation, do more by way of primary legislation, and less by using even Henry VIII powers, which our legal friends will be well aware of, which is an absolute nonsense, where you can amend primary legislation by unamendable order. Now, then, this is a nonsense that we have in the UK. It's nothing to do with Europe, but there are similar aspects within Europe, and all that needs to be sorted out. But it's not a question of being in and out to do that.
So we need less legislation.
Another question. Gentleman here.
Just a quick question with regards to immigration and what was highlighted previously. Right. This is when you were talking about a point system, isn't it in a sense with a point system when you are saying to somebody, oh yes, you look at a point system and you look at a person's sort of qualifications, and then based on that they will either gain entry to the country or not. Now, I am the grandson and great-grandson of immigrants. Now, under a point system, I would not be here. My grandmother came to this country dirt poor, no qualifications at all. Now, she came to this country because it was welcoming and she thought she would have opportunity. And she studied and studied and spent her whole life working for our National Health Service. But under a point system, she would not have got here, and I wouldn't be sitting here today.
Game, set and match.
Well, I think if you don't...
Let Ruth... No.
I don't mind. If you don't have some sort of filter, you would not be able to, if I may say so, control your immigration at all. And I hear what you say, but I suspect if that were to be the case, where you'd say, oh, well, we'll just open our borders to de facto everybody if we left the EU, that would be even less popular than the current policy, which is actually having open borders with the European Union citizens. Now, I'm aware that there probably aren't many people here who would like to see immigration control. I don't know. I'm just making a supposition which may be completely wrong. But let's be honest, there are an awful lot of people in this country who don't like the freedom of movement of labour. There is no question about it. They see their jobs under threat from immigrants. Now, you may agree with that or you disagree with that, but living in a democratic country, you cannot ignore things like that. And that is why successive governments of any colour, I suspect, would actually want to control immigration. I've said I'm relatively liberal about it, but governments may take a different view. Under those circumstances, they have to have some sort of criteria to filter people out.
No, I understand that.
But
completely.
sorry, that's the answer to your point,
yeah,
and I
cool.
understand you wouldn't be here if you,
Yeah,
if your grandmother wasn't here. But
I understand that completely, but I don't like this notion that you can almost, in a bureaucratic manner, look at human
how
life like
else? Forgive me for saying this. How else would you filter the number?
Yes, but
of
would
people?
this filter or non-return valve protect us from the return of expatriates from the Costa Brava?
Well, not expats, no.
Yeah. Well, look, and our rights to be going out to work in the other 27 countries, which thousands of young people are taking advantage of all over the United Kingdom. But in terms of people coming in here, very often the fear that's expressed is that you see ISIS, etc., moving in under the guise of this. In fact, over the last 5 or 6 years, some 7,000 people have been blocked from entry into the UK because we do have those controls still in existence. Now, that we're not in the Schengen, and therefore we do have the right to do that.
Would you have us in the Schengen?
To get fake IDs?
No, I think the referendum,
advocated
the referendum is on the basis of the rules as they stand now, and we are outside the Schengen area. Quite clearly, there is a right of any country to keep an eye on any terrorist organisation that may be trying to infiltrate its way in. But equally, in terms of the resources, into the skills that we need, and just the ordinary working manpower and woman power that we need in these islands. You think of the agricultural sector and the collecting of fruits and all that sort of thing.
David, I'm not
Sadly, our people aren't willing to do that work.
David, I'm not disputing any of that. That's why I've said that I have a relatively liberal approach to immigration. But will be up to the government of the day to decide what they want to do, obviously, about immigration if we leave. And then it is for them to decide with various political pressures upon them to make their decisions. You know that and I know.
Also, a lot of the issues around terrorism have been perpetrated by people who are indigenous to EU countries.
Yes, well,
yes.
here.
EU nationals. They haven't rushed in from Syria. We have time for one more little tiny mini question.
There's a lady here.
Woman here.
A lady?
A lady. Sorry, woman, I suppose you said.
You as well, Ruth. My father and partner currently work and have done over years work.
Sorry, could you? We can't hear it.
Can't hear.
Speak up, perhaps.
Hello. My father and my partner currently and have over the years worked in the automotive sector, and their companies such as BMW, Volkswagen, Mini, and Jaguar Land Rover, and they so heavily rely on the EU for manufacturing parts. How is the government going to secure jobs of people in the UK that work for these companies when they so heavily rely on parts from the EU?
Yeah, it's a huge sector, and you may talk about exporting British cars to the EU,
right, yeah.
but a lot of the manufacturing plants are European companies that have placed them here to feed into Europe, have they not?
Yes, and BMW, I think, owns Minis and whatnot. But as I said to you, the tariff against cars, the common external tariff as it's called, is 10%. And that's why I think the British government would push for a commercial trade agreement with the European Union. And as I also said, I think the Germans would be dead keen to agree to it because they have such a huge trade advantage. You know, trade and money, talks.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, if we're going to pay in to have a trade agreement, and we're basically going to pay in, like Norway, to be a part of the European common market, then basically it's going to be the same situation, but without any influence over it. And in Europe...
Well, we're talking about product regulations. That's what you need for exports. So, they're determined internationally. And we would buy into those. You know, no probs.
The automotive industry is very big in England. Obviously, we have They use our services because we are the best at building any
We're the
automotive. As a son of a father who works in the automotive industry as well, he works in Jaguar Land Rover, and obviously he travels to Europe with the car companies. He knows that they use British industry because they make the best cars and we are the best industry for it. So I think if we do leave the EU, that they're still going to use our industry and still use our factories.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's European ownership. Name a British car manufacturer that's owned in Britain.
It's going
that's the whole reality. That's the whole reality.
I mean, I can remember the 1970s when they were all owned by Britain, literally Britain, because they were nationalised, and they were not. Have you ever driven a Morris Marina?
They weren't the worst.
No, they weren't. But
You
I
should
can
try
think
for the
of
Electro.
fewer experiences that were less unpleasant,
Yeah,
more unpleasant.
It's
Right,
commercial.
yeah, okay, we are going to have to conclude at that point. But before we do that, and before I move to Derek to propose a vote of thanks, I'd like to see a show of hands on the nature of the motion, which is that this House considers that the UK should remain as a member of the EU. Those who agree with that, raise your hand.
Oh dear.
Thank you very much. Those who do not agree with it, raise your hand. A few brave and isolated individuals. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for your participation. And I would now like to hand you over to the Honourable Dr. Derek Halbert, who's going to propose a motion of thanks.
Ruth was described to me as formidable, and she's lived up to it today. And David was described to me by the late Emlyn Hooson, Lord Hooson of Llanidloes, as probably the best speaker I've ever seen. And he's lived up to that as well. So you had a rare opportunity to see brilliant public speaking at its best. And I'm bound to say the two students, given their first year and second year status, have done brilliantly well to follow in. Given the other demands of their time, I'm very grateful to both speakers for taking the trouble to come all the way from London here to Chester to speak to us, and they've given us a rare treat. I calculated when I was about to retire as a judge last year that in my career as a lawyer, I have either made or listened to something of the order of 54,000 speeches. These are among the best I've ever heard. Thank you very much.